Here's something that should genuinely unsettle you. The most dangerous place you could have been in 1870s America wasn't a saloon brawl, wasn't a cattle drive gone wrong, and it wasn't a confrontation with outlaws on an open trail. The most dangerous place you could have been was sitting down to a warm meal at a stranger's table. Because somewhere between, "Please have a seat," and "Can I get you anything else?" you might never stand up again. Today we're going deep, not just into what happened in southeastern Kansas in the early 1870s, but into the how and the why that most retellings completely skip over. We're going to examine what the Bloody Benders actually teach us about human psychology, about how evil operates in plain sight, about why entire communities can live alongside monsters for years without recognizing what's right in front of them, and about what the legal system of the era was utterly unprepared to handle. Because this isn't just a true crime story. This is a masterclass in predatory behavior, social manipulation, and the terrifying gap between appearance and reality. And by the end of this, you're going to look at certain social dynamics very differently than you did when you press play. To truly understand the Bender murders, you first have to understand the world they were committed in, because that world made them not just possible, but almost inevitable. The early 1870s Kansas frontier was one of the most socially chaotic environments in American history. This wasn't the romantic, mythologized West of Hollywood films. This was a place where infrastructure was essentially non-existent, where law enforcement meant whatever the nearest man with a gun and a badge decided it meant, and where thousands of people were moving through vast stretches of open land with no reliable way to communicate their whereabouts to anyone. Think about what travel actually looked like in that era. You loaded your wagon, you said goodbye to your family, and then you disappeared into the prairie for weeks or months at a time. There were no telegraphs at every waypoint. There were no scheduled stops where someone checked off your name on a list. If you vanished somewhere between Missouri and your destination, the only people who might notice were the ones waiting for you at the other end. And by the time they realized something was wrong, weeks had already passed. The frontier essentially created a perfect environment for predators. It provided targets in the form of travelers carrying cash and valuables. It provided isolation that made witnesses almost impossible. And it provided a ready-made explanation for disappearances. The frontier was dangerous. People went missing. That was simply understood as a fact of life. The Osage Trail in southeastern Kansas was a particularly active corridor in this period. Settlers, traders, and migrants moving between established towns passed through Labette County constantly, many of them carrying significant sums of money or valuables because they were either establishing new homesteads or traveling back east with the proceeds from selling land or livestock. They were, in the brutal sense of the word, targets, and the Benders understood this perfectly. What the Benders built wasn't just a murder operation, it was a business model. They established a legitimate-looking inn and general store right along this heavily traveled route, and they positioned it to intercept exactly the kind of travelers who would be carrying money and who would have no one expecting them at a specific time. This is predatory intelligence at work. The ability to identify a vulnerable population, insert yourself into their natural environment, and create a scenario where they come to you willingly. This is what distinguishes the Benders from simple, opportunistic killers. They planned, they constructed, they maintained a cover story for years, and that requires a degree of operational sophistication that the criminal justice frameworks of the 1870s had absolutely no conceptual language to describe. The word serial killer wouldn't even enter the American lexicon for another century. When investigators and community members tried to make sense of what the Benders had done, they had no template for it. They understood outlaws, they understood crimes of passion, they understood even calculated single murders for financial gain. But a family that had systematically lured and murdered at least 9 people, possibly significantly more, over the course of several years, with a consistent method and a carefully maintained public persona, that was genuinely without precedent in the American experience. Now let's talk about the family itself, because the family dynamic is where this story gets genuinely fascinating from a psychological standpoint. What we know about the Benders, and admittedly there are enormous gaps in the historical record, suggests a family unit that was almost purpose-built for the kind of operation they were running. And the roles each member played are worth examining in detail. Start with the patriarch, the man most records call John Bender Sr., though, as we'll discuss, whether Bender was even his real name is an open question. Every description of him emphasizes his physical intimidation and his social withdrawal. He was large, unkempt, profane, and communicated in grunts and low muttering. Neighbors found him deeply unsettling and largely avoided engaging with him. Now, here's what's psychologically interesting about that. In the operation the Benders were running, John Sr.'s intimidating presence was actually a liability in the front of house. You don't lure traveling strangers into your establishment with a terrifying, grunting patriarch glaring at them from the corner. So John Sr.'s role was almost certainly confined to the back, the physical execution of the murders once targets had been lured into position. He was the weapon in the room, not the salesperson. His alleged wife, the woman most sources call Ma Bender, presents a different profile. Every account emphasizes her volatile temper and her sharp, fast-talking manner. She appears to have been the logistical brain of the operation, the one managing the physical space and the practical mechanics of what happened after a murder. The descriptions of her temperament suggest someone who was deeply paranoid and controlling, someone who would have been constantly assessing threat levels, monitoring who was traveling through, deciding who was a safe target and who presented too much risk. The fact that she seems to have been the one who confronted Colonel York's search party and immediately went on offense, accusing them of harassment rather than cooperating, suggests a sophisticated understanding of how to manage suspicion. That's not an impulsive response, that's a practiced one. John Jr. is the most enigmatic member of the family. Contemporary accounts describe him as intellectually limited, socially awkward, prone to inappropriate laughter, and yet also as the most outwardly sociable Bender, the one most comfortable interacting with strangers. It's possible, even likely, that John Jr.'s apparent simplicity was partly a performance, or at least was strategically useful. A harmless, slightly bumbling young man who laughs too much and seems a little slow is not threatening. He's the last person you'd suspect. And his willingness to interact with travelers, to put them at ease, to seem approachable, that made him valuable in an operation that depended entirely on victims letting their guard down. And then there is Kate. Kate Bender is the figure that has captured the most historical attention, and for good reason. Because Kate understood something that the rest of her family almost certainly did not. She understood the power of a constructed social identity. She didn't just participate in luring victims. She built an entire public persona designed to generate attention, trust, and fascination. The lectures she gave under the name Professor Miss Katie Bender, the advertisements for her services as a medium and healer, the attendance at local dances and community events in Cherryville. This was deliberate, sustained image management in an era when such a concept barely existed. Now, Kate's philosophical beliefs, the advocacy for free love, the claim that humans had a moral right to commit murder, the identification as a spiritualist and healer, are often presented in historical accounts as the ravings of an eccentric, but psychologically they represent something more coherent and more disturbing. Kate had constructed an entire worldview that preemptively justified her behavior. If humans have a moral right to murder, then what the Benders were doing wasn't wrong, it was simply the exercise of a natural right. The spiritualist identity gave her a framework for seeming mysterious and powerful rather than dangerous. And the advocacy for unconventional relationships may have served to normalize whatever the actual nature of her relationship with John Jr. was, a relationship that most historians now believe was not that of siblings. This constructed belief system also served a crucial practical function. It kept Kate's name in circulation in the local community. People were curious about her, they talked about her, they came to see her give lectures. And all of that visibility paradoxically made her seem less suspicious. How could the local celebrity medium who everyone in Cherryville knew and talked about be involved in something sinister? Visibility as a shield, that's a sophisticated psychological maneuver, whether it was consciously designed or not. Here's where this story moves from historical curiosity into something genuinely instructive. Because what the Benders understood about victim selection is, in retrospect, chillingly methodical. And understanding that methodology matters because the psychological principles involved didn't disappear with the Benders. They show up in manipulative and predatory behavior patterns across 2 centuries of documented cases. The Benders didn't kill everyone who came through their door. We know this because multiple people survived encounters at the Bender Inn, including at least one man who narrowly escaped a hammer blow by the good fortune of turning around at the right moment. So there was selection happening. Victims were being chosen, and non-victims were being allowed to leave. What were the criteria? The financial component is obvious. Travelers carrying visible cash or valuables were prioritized. But the selection went beyond simple robbery. Victims appear to have been chosen partly based on their social isolation. Dr. William York, for instance, was traveling alone. James Longcott was a recently widowed man traveling with a young child, someone whose disappearance would be distressing to family members, but who had a plausible explanation for their vulnerability. Many of the other confirmed or suspected victims appear to have been solo travelers with limited immediate social networks. This is textbook predatory selection, and it mirrors patterns identified in criminal psychology research conducted a century after the Benders vanished. Isolated individuals without people actively tracking their movements. People who have a plausible reason to have changed plans unexpectedly. People who are visibly carrying resources worth taking. The Benders couldn't have read a criminology textbook, but they had apparently developed, through some combination of intuition and experience, a working model of how to identify low-risk, high-reward targets. The physical setup of the inn reinforced this selection process. The curtain dividing the cabin, that repurposed canvas wagon cover, did 2 things simultaneously. It created a semi-private space for the Benders in the back half of the building, which seemed perfectly reasonable in a tiny frontier cabin where the family needed some separation from customers. And it positioned seated guests with their backs to it, which was a seating arrangement that guests accepted without question because the table was simply placed that way. Nobody questioned it because it seemed like an obvious practical arrangement. The genius, and I use that word very deliberately and with considerable discomfort, was that the murderous mechanism was embedded in the completely ordinary architecture of hospitality. You sit down, you face the room, someone brings you food. This is how eating at an inn works. Except in this particular inn, what's behind you is not a kitchen wall, but a large canvas through which an arm holding a hammer can strike with lethal force. The close calls are illuminating here. Charles Howlett survived because he happened to turn around. The likely apocryphal story about John Wesley Hardin surviving because his instincts made him uncomfortable with his back to that curtain. Whether literally true or not, it points to something real. The Benders' method depended entirely on their victims' social compliance, on people sitting where they were placed, on people not questioning an unusual seating arrangement because questioning it would seem rude, on the social convention of hospitality overriding the instinct for self-preservation. How many people hesitated slightly before sitting down, felt some small unease, and then sat down anyway because it would have been awkward not to? We'll never know, but the number is almost certainly not 0. One of the most disturbing and least examined aspects of the Bender case is the question of why it took so long for anyone to connect the disappearances to the family. Because in retrospect, the evidence was not exactly hidden. Bodies were turning up in the county. Travelers were vanishing along a specific trail. The Bender properties sat right along that trail. And yet for the better part of 2 to 3 years, the connection was either not made or not acted upon. Part of the answer is structural. There was no centralized record-keeping of missing persons in 1870s Kansas. There was no law enforcement agency with jurisdiction over a wide enough area to notice patterns across multiple counties. When Benjamin Brown went missing, the people looking for him weren't comparing notes with the people who had previously looked for William York or Henry Mackenzie. Each disappearance was investigated, to the extent it was investigated at all, as an isolated incident. The systemic apparatus required to recognize a serial pattern simply did not exist. But there's also a psychological component that's more uncomfortable to examine. Communities are generally very resistant to the idea that the monsters are local. The frontier mythology held that danger came from hostile Native Americans, from roving outlaw bands, from the wild and unpredictable forces of nature. These were external threats, things that came from outside the community and could theoretically be guarded against or driven off. The idea that a German immigrant family running a small inn just northeast of Cherryville was methodically murdering travelers and burying them in the garden required a conceptual leap that the community's existing mental frameworks made very difficult. This isn't a failure unique to 1870s Kansas. It's a well-documented feature of human social cognition. We extend trust to people we interact with regularly and who conform to expected social roles. The Benders attended community events. Kate gave lectures. They operated a business that served local needs. They were embedded, however awkwardly, in the social fabric of the community. And that embeddedness created a kind of cognitive immunity, a presumption of innocence not based on evidence but on familiarity. They couldn't be doing what someone might suspect because we know them. They're our neighbors. Add to this the social dynamics around the Benders' more eccentric qualities. John Sr. was frightening and antisocial. Ma Bender was volatile and confrontational. These qualities, which in retrospect look like red flags, in context probably functioned as explanations that foreclosed further inquiry. Oh, those Benders. Strange family, keep to themselves. Better not get on the old woman's bad side. The eccentricity was processed as local color rather than as warning. And Kate's spiritualist activities, her lectures, her outspoken views, all of that made her unusual and somewhat controversial, but unusual and controversial is not the same as suspicious. If anything, her willingness to be publicly eccentric made the idea of a secret criminal operation seem less plausible. Why would someone engaged in systematic murder be simultaneously giving public lectures under her own name? When Colonel York's search party arrived at the Bender homestead, Ma Bender's response, immediately going on the offensive, accusing the colonel of harassment, is a classic example of a technique that psychologists sometimes call DARVO, which stands for Deny, Attack, and Reverse Victim and Offender. It's a manipulation strategy in which the actual perpetrator of harm responds to scrutiny by positioning themselves as the victim of unjust accusation. It works because it puts the accuser on the defensive, shifts the emotional energy of the encounter, and creates social pressure on the investigator to back off and apologize. And in this case, it worked long enough for the Benders to make their escape. The Benders' escape is itself a lesson in the institutional limitations of 19th century America. They had a head start that's difficult to precisely calculate, somewhere between days and a couple of weeks, because no one knew exactly when they fled. They had a wagon and horses. They had, presumably, the cash and valuables taken from their victims, and they were heading into a continental geography that made systematic tracking nearly impossible. Investigators managed to trace them as far as St. Louis before the trail went cold, which is actually impressive given the tools available. The telegram to New York City police suggesting the Benders planned to board a steamer bound for Alsace-Lorraine in France on a specific date in May of 1873 raises tantalizing questions. If accurate, it suggests the family had a pre-planned escape route, that they knew or strongly suspected that their operation would eventually be discovered, and they had already arranged where they would go when that happened. That level of advanced planning is consistent with everything else we know about how the Benders operated. The rewards posted, $1,000 from Colonel York, another $1,000 from the governor of Kansas, were enormous sums by the standards of the era, life-changing money. And yet they went uncollected. The most charitable interpretation is that the Benders made it to Europe and were genuinely beyond the reach of American authorities. The most dramatic interpretation, popularized by stories including the one attributed to Laura Ingalls Wilder's father, is that a vigilante party found them and killed them without creating any official record. The vigilante justice theory has a certain frontier logic to it. Why go through the trouble and uncertainty of a formal legal process when a rope in the dark accomplishes the same thing with none of the complications? But as compelling as that narrative is, the lack of anyone collecting the reward money actually cuts against it. Vigilante justice on the frontier was common enough and accepted enough that someone could likely have claimed credit and collected the reward without serious legal consequence. The most credible thread is the one provided by researcher Lee Ralph's work connecting the Benders to census records in Syracuse and Decatur, and ultimately to an 1895 death notice in a German-language Swiss newspaper seeking heirs for an Anna Maria Bender, who had died in Kirchhardt, Germany. If this was Ma Bender, and the evidence Ralph presents is compelling, even if not conclusive, then at least one member of the family died in Europe, old, apparently alone, and seemingly unpunished. Whether John Sr., John Jr., and Kate lived out similar quiet endings somewhere in Europe, or whether their fates took different turns, remains genuinely unknown. What the bloody Benders ultimately leave us with isn't just a remarkable historical mystery. It's a portrait of how evil actually operates in the world, not as an obviously recognizable force that announces itself with menace and clearly signals its presence, but as something that embeds itself in the ordinary, that wears the costume of the mundane, that exploits our social conventions and our cognitive shortcuts and our very human tendency to extend trust to familiar faces. The Benders succeeded for as long as they did because they understood, consciously or not, that the best camouflage for predatory behavior is the appearance of normalcy. A family running a small inn, a young woman giving lectures on spiritualism, a slightly awkward young man laughing too loud at his own jokes. These are not the faces we imagine when we imagine monsters. And that gap between imagination and reality, that's where the danger lives. The frontier is long gone, but the psychological landscape the Benders navigated is not. The impulse to extend trust based on familiarity, the tendency to explain away warning signs with convenient social categories, the systemic gaps that allow patterns to go unrecognized when institutions aren't designed to see them. These are features of human social life that 2 centuries of civilization haven't dissolved. And maybe the most valuable thing the story of the Bloody Benders offers is a reminder that awareness, genuine, uncomfortable, socially awkward awareness, is still one of the most powerful tools we have. Thanks for spending this time with me today. If this kind of deep historical and psychological exploration is what you're here for, you know what to do.